They weren't surrounded because they were losing. They were surrounded because they allowed it. 800 Marines stood on a narrow ridge in the jungle of Guadalcanal. No reinforcements, no escape routes, barely enough ammunition to survive the night. Every military rule said the same thing. When you're outnumbered 3-1, you retreat. Edson did the opposite. He ordered his men to pull in tighter, to let the enemy come closer, to close the distance on purpose. Because on that ridge, distance wasn't safety. Distance was death. Guadalcanal wasn't supposed to be a decisive battlefield. Not on paper. A remote island. Endless jungle. Disease. Mud. Heat. Nothing about it suggested it would become the hinge of the Pacific War. But by September 1942, everything depended on one strip of land carved out of the jungle, Henderson Field. As long as that airfield remained operational, American aircraft controlled the skies. And as long as Americans controlled the skies, Japanese supply lines bled to death. That made the ridge south of the airfield something more than terrain. It made it a lock. If the ridge fell, the airfield fell. If the airfield fell, Guadalcanal was lost. And on the night of September 12th, that ridge was held by just 800 Marines. They were exhausted. They had been fighting for weeks in conditions that destroyed bodies faster than bullets. Food spoiled, equipment rusted, men lost weight, strength, and time. There were no fresh units waiting behind them. No second line to fall back to. No clean withdrawal route through the jungle. The intelligence reports were clear. Japanese forces over 2,000 strong were already moving through the darkness. Not probing, not testing. They were maneuvering to surround the ridge and erase it in a single night assault. Every doctrine manual written before the war agreed on what came next. When outnumbered 3-1, you don't hold. You don't compress your line. You don't wait to be encircled. You disengage. You trade ground for time. You preserve the force. But Guadalcanal offered no ground to trade. Behind the Marines was Henderson Field. Beyond that, nothing. Retreat meant collapse. And Edson understood something that the manuals didn't account for. This wasn't a battle of movement. It was a battle of distance. Japanese infantry doctrine relied on closing ground, speed, shock, aggression in the dark. They believed that once contact was made, willpower would decide the outcome. American doctrine assumed something different. That modern warfare was decided before the enemy reached you. That firepower, preparation, and coordination mattered more than numbers. On that ridge, only one of those doctrines could survive. Edson didn't see encirclement as a threat. He saw it as a mechanism. The tighter his perimeter became, the shorter the distances the enemy would have to cross. And every yard the Japanese advanced would cost them time, cohesion, and lives. This wasn't a gamble on courage. It was a calculation. The ridge itself was narrow, barely elevated, just high enough to dominate the jungle approaches below. During daylight, Marines had turned it into something far more dangerous than it appeared. Approach routes were studied. Vegetation was cleared to open lanes of fire. Distances were measured and memorized. Mortar targets were plotted. Artillery coordinates were registered with Henderson Field. None of it would be visible in the dark. But every Marine on that ridge knew exactly where the enemy would have to move. By choosing not to retreat, Edson removed uncertainty. There would be no confusion about direction. No sudden breakthroughs behind the line. No collapsing flanks. The enemy would come from predictable angles, across exposed ground, uphill, and they would do it at night. Exactly when disciplined defenders with prepared fire had the advantage. As darkness settled over Guadalcanal, the jungle began to change. The constant noise of insects faded. Movement replaced sound. Somewhere beyond the tree line, thousands of men were advancing in silence. Edson gave his final orders. Not to advance, not to counterattack, but to hold fire, to wait, and to let the enemy come close enough for distance to do its work. The ridge didn't look like a fortress. It wasn't high. It wasn't wide. It didn't dominate the landscape the way defensive positions were supposed to. On a map, it barely registered. But war isn't decided by how terrain looks. It's decided by how it's prepared. Edson understood that before the Japanese ever reached the tree line, this position wouldn't be held by mass. It would be held by geometry. During daylight hours, the Marines worked without rest, not building trenches deep enough to hide in, but shaping the ground into something predictable. Every approach to the ridge was examined. Not just the obvious paths, but the subtle ones. Ravines, shallow slopes, folds in the ground where an attacking force might instinctively move. Jungle vegetation was cut back selectively, not cleared entirely, just enough to create corridors, killing lanes. To the untrained eye, the jungle still looked dense, but to a Marine behind the line, it had become transparent. Distances were measured in paces and memorized. Firing arcs were assigned and overlapped. No weapon stood alone. Every rifle position was tied into a larger pattern. This wasn't about individual marksmanship. It was about ensuring that no attacker could move without being seen, heard, or killed. The machine guns were placed where they mattered most. Not forward, not exposed, but offset so they could fire across the slope, not straight down it. Enfilade, fire, a concept as old as firearms and just as lethal. When the enemy advanced uphill, they wouldn't face one gun. They would walk into several, each covering the other. Mortar teams worked nearby, pre-plotting firing solutions in daylight. They couldn't afford to calculate under pressure at night. Distances were fixed, angles recorded, target areas assigned numbers, not names. So when the call came, no explanation would be needed. Artillery from Henderson Field was registered the same way. The gunners wouldn't see what they were firing at. They didn't need to. They were aiming at coordinates chosen hours earlier, places where Japanese infantry would be forced to pass if they attacked. This wasn't improvisation. It was preparation, and preparation removed panic from the equation. The Marines knew exactly where the enemy would appear. They also knew something else. The Japanese would attack at night. They always did. Japanese doctrine prized shock and momentum. Darkness was supposed to amplify both. But in the jungle, darkness worked differently. Visibility collapsed for everyone, which meant movement became the giveaway. Experienced Marines had learned to listen instead of look. Footsteps, branches bending, the faint scrape of equipment against vegetation. The jungle carried sound in strange ways, but it carried it all the same. That knowledge had been earned the hard way. Over weeks of fighting, men had learned how far sound traveled, how quickly it betrayed an approach, how silence often meant something worse was coming. The Japanese command assumed the Americans would be demoralized. That exhaustion, disease, and isolation would have weakened discipline. They were wrong. American training emphasized something Japanese doctrine undervalued: fire control. Marines weren't taught to empty magazines. They were taught to wait, to identify, to confirm, to kill efficiently. Every rifleman on the ridge had limited ammunition. That scarcity forced discipline. Every round had a purpose. The machine gun crews were the backbone of the defense. Heavy, old by modern standards, but reliable. Water-cooled barrels meant sustained fire, not bursts of desperation, but continuous pressure. As long as those guns stayed operational, the ridge could not be rushed. Edson knew this. That's why he pulled his perimeter inward. A wider line would have spread his weapons thin, created gaps, forced guns to cover too much ground. A tighter perimeter concentrated firepower. It shortened distances, improved communication, made every position mutually supporting. Encirclement didn't weaken the defense. It strengthened it. By the time night fell, the ridge was no longer just a place. It was a system. Each Marine understood his role within it, not the whole plan, just his part. That was enough. As darkness settled, Edson moved through the line one last time, not giving speeches, not offering reassurance, just checking. Ammunition counts, sectors of fire, communications. Everything that could be controlled was controlled. Everything that couldn't be accepted. The jungle began to quiet. Insects faded. Birds disappeared. That silence meant movement. Somewhere below, thousands of men were forming up. The Japanese believed they were about to attack a position held by exhausted defenders clinging to a narrow ridge. What they were actually facing was something else entirely. A battlefield designed to remove advantage. A defense built not on bravery, but on inevitability. All that remained was for the enemy to step into it. The first sign wasn't gunfire, it was silence. The jungle below the ridge went unnaturally still, as if something had pressed the air flat. Marines who had learned the rhythms of Guadalcanal recognized it immediately. This wasn't calm. It was movement without sound. Edson didn't need confirmation reports. He already knew the attack was coming. At 11:45 p.m., the silence broke. Mortar rounds began falling short of the ridge, scattering explosions through the jungle. They weren't precise, they weren't coordinated. They were probing shots meant to unsettle, not destroy. The Marines stayed still. No return fire. No wasted ammunition. The shelling stopped as suddenly as it began. That was the signal. Moments later, figures emerged from the tree line. Not in disorder, not hesitantly, they came forward in force. Japanese infantry surged uphill, voices rising as they moved, the traditional battle cries echoing through the darkness. The sound was meant to intimidate, to shock defenders into breaking. It didn't work. The Marines waited until the enemy crossed the first measured line. Then the ridge came alive. Machine guns opened first, not firing wildly, but raking the slope sideways. Enfilade, fire. Rounds cut through advancing formations at angles the attackers hadn't anticipated. Men fell not at the front of the charge, but along its length. Entire files collapsed at once. Rifle fire followed immediately, controlled, deliberate. Each shot cracked through the night, punctuating the deeper roar of the guns. The hillside became a grid of intersecting fire, every lane activated exactly as planned. The Japanese expected defenders to fire toward noise. Instead, they faced defenders who fired toward certainty. The slope turned into a killing zone within seconds. Momentum, the single most important element of an infantry assault, evaporated. Men tripped over bodies. Units lost alignment. Commands dissolved into confusion. The attack slowed, and once an assault slowed on that ridge, it was already dying. Japanese officers attempted to push their men forward, urging them to close the distance. They believed that once contact was made, American resistance would crumble. They never reached that range. Mortars began landing among the attackers, detonating with brutal accuracy. The firing data had been calculated hours earlier. There was no need to adjust. The enemy had walked exactly where the Marines expected them to. Explosions tore open formations that were already compressed by the terrain. The first wave disintegrated before it reached the crest. But the attack didn't stop. Japanese doctrine demanded persistence. Losses were acceptable. Momentum had to be regained. A second wave emerged from the jungle. It faced the same terrain, the same fire lanes, the same weapons. Only now the ground ahead was littered with bodies. This time, the Marines didn't wait as long. Fire opened sooner. The guns had settled into rhythm. Barrels were hot, but steady. Crews rotated positions smoothly, keeping pressure constant. What Japanese commanders were only beginning to understand was that this wasn't a fragile defense. It wasn't holding by luck. It was functioning exactly as designed. The ridge itself forced attackers to bunch together, cleared vegetation, removed concealment. The uphill approach slowed movement at the worst possible moment. Every element amplified the others. As the second wave faltered, artillery from Henderson Field began to speak. The guns didn't fire blindly. They fired at registered coordinates. High explosive shells detonated behind the attackers, cutting off retreat routes and trapping men in the open. Fragmentation scythed through units already pinned by machine gun fire. The Japanese assault lost cohesion completely. Small groups attempted to push forward on their own, driven by training and desperation. They were cut down individually. By now, Marine riflemen were firing at visible targets. Not sound, muzzle flashes. Movement, shadows against the slope. The darkness that was supposed to protect the attackers betrayed them instead. Japanese leaders began to die in disproportionate numbers. Officers and non-commissioned officers were forced to expose themselves to restore order. American marksmen learned quickly what those movements looked like. The chain of command began to collapse. Edson monitored the fight from his command position near the crest. Reports came in steadily. No breakthroughs. No penetrations. Enemy losses mounting. This wasn't a probe. This was a full commitment. And it was failing. The Japanese launched a third assault, this time with more urgency, more noise, more force. It didn't matter. The ridge no longer reacted to the attack. It absorbed it. Fire continued uninterrupted. Mortars adjusted slightly, walking their explosions across packed formations. Artillery fired with mechanical precision. What had been an assault became an ordeal. Men advanced because doctrine demanded it, not because success was possible. By midnight, the slope was a graveyard. The Japanese force that had entered the jungle hours earlier as a coordinated unit was now fragmented, bleeding, and disoriented. Momentum was gone. And without momentum, the attack had no future. Edson understood what this moment represented. The enemy had committed heavily. They had failed. But they weren't finished. A force trained to value attack over survival would not disengage easily. The worst was not over yet. But something fundamental had already shifted. The ridge had proven it could not be rushed. Numbers had failed. Shock had failed. Night had failed. The battle had entered a new phase, and now the Japanese would have to change how they fought, or accept what was already becoming inevitable. By midnight, the Japanese command understood one thing clearly. Mass assault had failed. The ridge had not broken. The Marines had not panicked. Firepower had done exactly what it was designed to do. Continuing frontal attacks would only multiply the dead, so the strategy changed. Instead of force, the Japanese would use infiltration. Instead of momentum, dispersion. Instead of shock, surprise. Small units began moving independently through the jungle. No battle cries, no coordinated charges, just quiet movement guided by experienced troops who knew how to disappear into darkness and vegetation. On paper, it was the correct adaptation. In reality, it created a new problem. Dispersion destroyed concentration, and without concentration, breakthrough was impossible. Marine listening posts began reporting movement from sectors that had gone silent earlier, not large formations, individuals, small groups. The enemy was no longer coming straight up the slope. They were trying to slip around it. Edson reacted immediately. Reserves were pulled forward, not to reinforce the line, but to hunt. These were not inexperienced men. They were Marines who had learned how to fight in jungle darkness without orders. Small unit leaders were given authority to act on contact. No waiting, no confirmation, no hesitation. If you heard movement, you moved toward it. The ridge became something different. Less a fixed defense, more a series of lethal reactions. Japanese infiltration teams reached positions dangerously close to key weapons. Grenades exploded near machine gun nests. Rifle fire cracked from unexpected angles. For brief moments, the fight collapsed into chaos. Close combat replaced distance. But this was where the Japanese adaptation failed completely. Their doctrine assumed infiltration would fracture the defense, that small attacks would overwhelm discipline. Instead, they met Marines trained to fight independently. Fire teams maneuvered in the dark. Counterattacks launched within seconds of contact. Japanese soldiers who reached the perimeter found themselves isolated, fighting alone or in pairs against defenders who could support each other. The enemy had traded mass for stealth. The Marines exploited the trade immediately. Artillery fire continued, but now it was different. Forward observers were calling in fire dangerously close to friendly positions, sometimes within yards. The risk was calculated. Shells detonated just beyond Marine lines, shredding infiltrators before they could regroup. Mortars followed the same pattern. The jungle lit up in brief, violent flashes. Every explosion revealed movement. Every movement drew fire. The night turned against the attackers completely. Japanese units attempting to coordinate infiltration lost contact with one another. Radio communication was nearly impossible. Command authority dissolved. Small groups were destroyed one by one. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was attrition. The longer the night lasted, the worse it became. Marines rotated weapons crews, redistributed ammunition, shifted positions by instinct. Japanese forces did none of that. They bled manpower with every minute. At one point, enemy soldiers reached a machine gun position and attempted to neutralize it at close range. They failed. Not because of heroics, but because the position was supported. Riflemen covered the gun. Nearby squads counterattacked instantly. What the Japanese thought were weak points were actually nodes in a system. By dispersing their attack, they had turned strength into vulnerability. Edson recognized the pattern. This wasn't an attack designed to win. It was an attack designed to survive failure. And that made it worse, because survival without momentum meant prolonged exposure to fire. As the hours passed, Japanese casualties mounted beyond recovery. Units ceased to exist as units. Men withdrew without orders. Others stayed and died because no one told them otherwise. The ridge remained intact. The Marines were exhausted but organized. Ammunition was low. Some machine gun crews were nearing critical limits. But the Japanese situation was worse. They had lost cohesion. They had lost leadership. They had lost the ability to shape the fight. By the early hours of September 14th, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the timing remained. Dawn was approaching, and daylight would end the battle decisively. Japanese commanders understood what daylight meant. Without darkness, infiltration was impossible. Without concealment, retreat would be exposed. Continuing the attack meant annihilation. Withdrawal was the only option left. But withdrawal through jungle terrain, under artillery observation with shattered units, was not a clean process. As Japanese forces began pulling back, Marine fire followed them methodically. No pursuit. No reckless advance. Just pressure. The ridge had done its work. When the jungle finally quieted, the night had consumed an entire attacking force, not through a single decisive moment, but through hundreds of small, controlled, lethal decisions. The Japanese had tried to solve a firepower problem with courage and adaptation. It hadn't been enough. The ridge had proven something brutal and undeniable. Once an attack loses momentum, every minute it continues only increases the cost. And on Guadalcanal, that cost had become irreversible. The battle didn't end with a final charge. It ended with silence. As dawn approached on September 14th, the jungle around the ridge began to empty. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but steadily, as scattered Japanese survivors pulled back through the undergrowth, carrying wounded comrades or abandoning them when they could no longer move. There was no signal for victory, no cheer, no celebration. The Marines stayed where they were. Edson ordered his men to hold their positions and not pursue. The night had already decided the outcome. Advancing into the jungle would only trade a controlled victory for unnecessary risk. When the light finally broke through the canopy, it revealed what darkness had concealed. The slope below the ridge was covered in bodies, not clustered in one place, not piled at a single breakthrough point. They lay scattered across the approaches, marking the failure of every assault route the Japanese had attempted during the night. Each group told the same story: an advance, sudden fire, no progress. Japanese equipment lay abandoned along the withdrawal paths. Rifles dropped to lighten the load. Mortars left behind when their crews were killed. Packs torn open. Personal items spilling into the mud. This wasn't the aftermath of a close fight. It was the residue of a force that had been broken. Marine patrols moved cautiously beyond the perimeter, counting bodies and gathering intelligence. The numbers became clear quickly. Over 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the slopes and in the jungle beyond. Many more had been wounded so severely that they would never return to combat. American losses were staggeringly low by comparison. Fewer than 50 Marines had been killed or wounded during the night. For analysts studying casualty ratios, the result bordered on disbelief. This wasn't a narrow defensive success. It was annihilation. The reason lay not in a single moment, but in accumulation. Every Japanese assault had entered the same prepared space. Every adjustment had been anticipated. Every minute the attack continued had multiplied losses. The ridge hadn't needed to defeat the enemy quickly. It had only needed to outlast them. Japanese commanders had committed over 1,500 men to the assaults throughout the night. By morning, large portions of those units no longer existed as coherent formations. Entire platoons were gone. Company-level leadership had been erased. Communication networks had collapsed. What remained were fragments, men without orders, without coordination, without a way forward. The failure went deeper than tactics. It exposed a fundamental mismatch. Japanese doctrine had assumed that determination could overcome material disadvantage, that courage, shock, and persistence would break any defense. On the ridge, that belief collapsed. American doctrine assumed the opposite, that a prepared defense, properly supported, would destroy an attacker long before close combat decided anything. The numbers proved which assumption was correct. Edson's position hadn't held because the Marines fought harder. It held because the fight had been shaped before the enemy ever arrived. The implications were immediate. The Japanese offensive capability on Guadalcanal was effectively destroyed. The units that had been intended to retake Henderson Field no longer had the strength, leadership, or organization to attempt it again. Without control of the ridge, the airfield remained operational. And with the airfield operational, American aircraft continued to dominate the island. Japanese supply convoys were attacked from the air. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Attrition accelerated. What had begun as a single-night battle cascaded into strategic failure. For the Marines on the ridge, the aftermath was quieter. Weapons were cleaned. Ammunition redistributed. Wounded evacuated. Machine gun crews inspected barrels that had fired thousands of rounds without failure. Rifles were wiped down, actions checked, magazines refilled from captured stocks where possible. There was no sense of triumph, only exhaustion. Men who had remained in fighting positions for hours stood up slowly, muscles stiff and shaking. Some stared at the ground below with hollow expressions, trying to process what they were seeing. The battlefield wasn't dramatic, it was methodical. Patterns of death revealed patterns of decision. Japanese losses clustered in fire lanes. Bodies marked the edges of cleared vegetation. Crater patterns showed where artillery had sealed retreat routes. The terrain itself testified. This hadn't been chaos, it had been controlled destruction. For American commanders elsewhere in the Pacific, the lesson was immediate and profound. Japanese forces were not invincible. They could be defeated decisively, not by matching aggression, but by denying it. The ridge demonstrated that disciplined defenders, using modern firepower and coordinated support, could destroy numerically superior attackers. Regardless of reputation, that lesson would be carried forward. In future battles, American forces would rely more heavily on prepared defenses, integrated artillery, and flexible small unit leadership. Japanese planners faced a more uncomfortable reality. The assumptions that had guided early victories about Western weakness, about morale, about shock, were no longer reliable. On Guadalcanal, those assumptions had been tested and found wanting. The ridge south of Henderson Field did not fall. Instead, it became a graveyard for an entire offensive. And in doing so, it marked the moment when the balance of power in the Pacific began to shift permanently. The ridge didn't matter because of how many men died on it. Plenty of battles in the Pacific would claim more lives. It mattered because of what it proved. Before Guadalcanal, Japanese forces carried a reputation that bordered on myth. They were aggressive, relentless, willing to accept losses that other armies would not. Early victories across the Pacific had reinforced a dangerous belief that determination alone could overwhelm any opponent. Edson's Ridge shattered that belief, not with spectacle, but with evidence. The Japanese assault failed not because of bad luck or weather or individual hesitation. It failed because its underlying assumptions were wrong. The idea that morale could substitute for firepower, that shock could overcome preparation. That persistence would eventually break a modern defense. On that ridge, none of it worked. American forces had demonstrated something the Japanese command had underestimated: professional competence. Not brilliance, not heroism, competence. Units that could hold their ground under pressure. Weapons systems designed for sustained fire. Doctrine that emphasized coordination over impulse. For the Japanese high command, the implications were severe. The failure on Guadalcanal forced a reassessment of both tactics and strategy. Offensive operations that relied on massed infantry attacks were no longer viable against an enemy with superior firepower and air support. More importantly, the defeat revealed limits that could not be solved quickly. Japan's industrial base could not match American production. Its logistical system was already overstretched. Replacing experienced infantry lost in a single night was not possible. Those losses were permanent. For the Americans, the effect was the opposite. Guadalcanal validated years of training and doctrine that had never been tested at scale. Small unit leadership, fire discipline, integrated artillery and air support. The belief that preparation mattered more than numbers was no longer theoretical. It had been proven. Commanders across the Pacific took note. Defensive positions became more deliberate. Artillery integration more precise. Night operations focused less on aggression and more on control. The psychological impact was just as important. American troops now knew they could stand against Japanese attacks and win decisively. The aura of inevitability surrounding Japanese infantry dissolved. Confidence replaced uncertainty. That shift would echo across future battles from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines and eventually to the edges of Japan itself. Edson's Ridge also marked a quieter transition. The war stopped being about who wanted victory more. It became about who could sustain it. Industrial capacity, logistics, training systems. The kind of war the United States was built to fight. The ridge south of Henderson Field never became famous in the way large battles did. There were no sweeping advances, no dramatic counteroffensives, just a line that did not break. But that line held long enough for air power to strangle Japanese supply routes, long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough for the initiative to shift permanently. By the time Japanese commanders accepted the reality of Guadalcanal, it was already too late. The offensive spirit that had driven early victories had been bled dry, not by a single crushing defeat, but by a defense that refused to give ground. The Marines who held that ridge did not see themselves as turning points in history. They had simply done what they were trained to do. But history records outcomes, not intentions. And the outcome of that night was clear. The Pacific War did not end on Edson's Ridge, but the direction it would take was decided there. They weren't surrounded because they were losing. They were surrounded because the distance favored them. On that ridge, the Japanese believed numbers would decide the outcome. They believed courage could overcome preparation. They believed persistence would break resistance. They were wrong. What stopped them wasn't bravery. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even surprise. It was a system built to make every step forward cost more than the last. The Marines didn't win because they fought harder. They won because the fight had already been decided. Before the first shot was fired, distance was measured, fire was planned, ground was shaped into inevitability. By the time the enemy understood what was happening, there was nothing left to change. On Guadalcanal, encirclement didn't mean collapse, it meant control. And that lesson didn't stay on that ridge. It followed American forces across the Pacific, into every defense built with discipline instead of desperation, into a war where preparation mattered more than will. The night ended, the ridge held, and with it, the direction of the war quietly changed.